Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Undoctrinate Yourself. Today, I have the pleasure of mediating a conversation between Dr. Sabine Hazan, who is a microbiome expert and clinician, and Jack Kruse, who has, I think, been on the podcast 5 times and needs no introduction at this point. So we have about an hour and a half to really get into it, and there's so much we want to cover with regards to the microbiome and the interplay with the light environment and also endogenously produced light and biophotons. So I just want to welcome you both onto the podcast to start. And yeah, I don't know where we want to kind of kick things off. We could kind of start in a number of directions, but maybe with like some brief background because Sabina's never been on the podcast before. So if you want to just say maybe what you've been up to recently and what your interests are, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Well, I'm a gastroenterologist by trade. I kind of was doing clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies for years. Over 3 decades, I've done over, 300 clinical trials between me and my sister and my husband. And clinical trials took me to this path of fecal transplant, using stools of healthy donors to implant in patients with C. diff. And then when we saw more, just not just me, but other doctors that were doing that procedure as gastroenterologists, when we saw more was happening, like 2 patients of Colleen Kelly that improved alopecia areata, Sahil Khanna at Mayo Clinic with urinary infections improving with fecal transplant. My own case of Alzheimer's, one could say I started going rogue from pharma. And I think, and then I started my genetic sequencing lab, ProgenaBiome, to really understand the microbiome, to really see what we're seeing when we talk about implants helping. And COVID was the perfect storm that kind of got me into this because I said, well, this is now or never. Here's a microbe that's been designed, and here I have a genetic lab that's basically trying to figure out the microbiome. And here I am also, I have a portal with the FDA to do clinical trials, and I work with a lot of scientists that have innovated drugs for pharma. So I figured I was in the right, position during COVID to kind of figure this out. And here we are, really as a revolution. I think the microbiome is a way to look into the future, in my opinion. And it gives us another insight that we didn't have before. And so I was excited to talk to Jack about, his work.
Love it. Where should we take it from here? I mean, I pulled some papers, by the way, so that we can look as we go, because I think one of the areas that I'm very interested in studying when I start the lab is the specific frequencies and wavelengths of light that are produced by microbes in the gut and how they're using light to communicate with one another. And there was a really, really cool paper that I pulled, and maybe we can look at it at some point on the call, from 2018, showing that there's actually non-local communication happening between different bacteria. And so they basically took, they had E. coli cultures, and then they had another bacterial species as well. And they either had them being inoculated with hydrogen peroxide or not. And they found that the culture that got inoculated with hydrogen peroxide created a response in a non-inoculated culture of the same species that was at a completely different location. So it was not being affected directly by the hydrogen peroxide stress response. And they have some mechanistic insights worked out with phonons, and they talk about how circular DNA, which of course, for the people listening, the mitochondria and bacteria, they share a ton in common because mitochondria are seen as this very long evolution of an alpha proteobacteria organism from, way, way, way back. And they make this hypothesis that the circular DNA in mitochondria and bacteria actually is a toroid that can create a magnetic field due to the electrons actually localizing around the circular DNA, and that could actually be used as a way to communicate with other bacteria. And there's even some research showing that these toroidal fields can actually impart resistance, antibacterial resistance, to other bacteria that are not in the same culture. So it's like there's a lot of mind-blowing things that are going on with bacteria, and given how many bacteria are in the gut as well, like, more bacterial cells throughout the body than human cells, it's like they are a huge part of our health, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface about what they're actually doing.
And not only in our bodies, but around us, right?
Yes.
microbes that are essentially there to, kill us or heal us, right? Or in the soil. So I
Mhm.
think it's a fascinating interplay of microbes, and we're just a reservoir for them, in my opinion. I think what raised the idea for me, and what got me interested in Jack to begin with was actually a lecture that he gave. um, and I forgot, it was in a classroom somewhere. I think it was in New Jersey somewhere, but it was like way back before the pandemic occurred. And he was talking about sunlight specifically on the abdomen, right? And what's the key things that I discovered through, and it stayed with me. I don't know, you pick up things in life where, something stays, and you just ask yourself, you know, what's the meaning of that? But you kind of tuck it in the back of your mind, and then eventually it kind of starts coming back when you see something else. During the pandemic, I started testing the microbiome, and we were noticing that people that had severe COVID had zero bifidobacteria, a bacteria that's present in your probiotics, right? And unfortunately, not a bacteria that you could say, oh, well, take a probiotic and it's going to help you, because that's not the fact. But a bacteria that started the whole, billion-dollar industry of probiotics, right? So what we noticed was babies had a lot of that bacteria. Old people had none of that. Severe COVID patients lost it, and the people that were exposed to COVID but never got COVID had a lot of that bacteria. One of the things that we discovered also was that vitamin D increases that bacteria. Another interesting thing that we discovered during the pandemic was the whole idea of vitamin C increases bifidobacteria, and then also in short term increased it. And it was interesting because when you talk to scientists who said, if you put a queen on the belly of the patient, then you would start feeling the effects of the ivermectin faster. And so, when you put all this together, vitamin D increases bifidobacteria, the sunlight on the abdomen, you have to ask yourself, is the sun on the abdomen directly hitting those microbes and therefore calming them to reproduce, right? And so I think that's how it happens. And that's how, all this is coming to light. The other thing that's interesting is that, what is the sun doing to plants? What is the sun doing, to nature? The idea of sunlight is so important. And here we are working with different wavelength of sunlight, right? And we're realizing that, look, if I'm in a light in my office, it's actually detrimental to me. But if I'm outside, you know, it's much better for me, right? And people feel better when they're hiking, when they're outdoors. So I think there is a huge power to light. That's going to be the future. We're going to see that. We're definitely seeing data on red light, improving, hair. When you see these people that are wearing these helmets of red light and it's improving their hair growth, you have to ask the question, well, what frequency? What is it doing? What is it doing to the microbiome? What is it decreasing the proteobacteria? Is it increasing the bifido? Those are all the questions, we want to see.
Yeah, I would take it way more proximal. I'm not really, I shouldn't say this, but I'm gonna. I'm not I don't think that the microbiome is the big story in the world. What the big story is that you have to understand decentralized medicine, like the anatomy of the gut that Dr. Hazen and I learned in medical school. That curriculum is largely, what I would call boilerplate for doctors. What the microbiome is to Dr. Hazen is kind of like watching a movie in a movie screen. She's able to see what Uncle Jack is interested in. I'm at the projector. I'm interested in seeing the movie come from the projector to hit the screen. And I guess what I'm trying to say is what happens upstream of the microbiome is the key to the story. And when you understand what's upstream, that means that you have to know a little bit about really what the gut's doing. So, for example, the gut has some very interesting things that we know about. The first part of it is innervated by the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a cranial nerve. Most people don't know that the vagus nerve also is highly myelinated. What does that mean? That means that the myelin level has a link to how much mitochondria is there. Alexis mentioned something earlier that mitochondria came from endosymbiosis. We just found out literally in the last 6 months that we've always believed that just like all electrons are the same, that all mitochondria are the same. We just found out we have two different kinds of mitochondria now. We have one with Kruse and one without. And it turns out in the microbiome that the microbiology is different with those Kruse, and those bacteria release different light. What else is different about the vagus nerve all the way down to the transverse mesocolon? That the amount of mitochondria associated with the vagus nerve is different than what it is in the enteric nervous system. Why? The enteric nervous system doesn't have as much myelin. Therefore, it doesn't have as many mitochondria. Here's the interesting part that Dr. Hazan may be interested in. In the gut, proximal gut, below the lower esophageal sphincter, you have 10 to the 1 bacteria. Most of those are Helicobacter. They're also a very specific type of bacteria that emit ultra weak UV light. We know that from some of the data that's been out in the microbiome research. Down distal from your transverse mesocolon to your asshole, that's where you have 10 to the 4th bacteria. Most of those are anaerobes. And this is where the myelin isn't as great. It's where the mitochondria are more exposed, and they create different light signatures. So you have to ask yourself the question, look at what's going on. Dr. Hazan brought up the point about the rectus abdominis. It has more POMC in it. That's the reason why it's more sensitive to sunlight on the surface. There's not a direct connection there. We know that because we know how UV light penetrates. But where the connection is made is there's a VDR receptor on the inner mitochondrial membrane that actually inhibits it. That's actually what the microbiome is really doing. And the other interesting point is when you understand the difference in the anatomy of the gut and see that there's a link between levels of myelination, levels of mitochondria, and then you realize that mitochondria in myelinated nerves tend to be right around the nodes of Ranvier. Then you have to ask yourself the question, does the enteric nervous system have nodes of Ranvier that are similar to the vagus nerve? And it turns out that's not true. That's also a difference. And I know that's a difference that Dr. Hazan didn't learn in medical school, because I know I didn't learn it in medical school. But it turns out in decentralized medicine, in biophysics, these have huge implications. Why? Because as Alexis has found out since she's entangled with me, that mitochondria are the source of ultra-weak biophotons. And biophotons have been found by biophysicists who use photomultipliers. This is not like bullshit story. Everything alive makes light, and it turns out the spectrum of light it makes is very different. So, for example, and I'll give you this example because this is in your world, Dr. Hazan. Most people in your world know the story of Barry Marshall. He tried to put most of the general surgeons out of business in 1980s and 1990s when he believed that Helicobacter was the cause of ulcers and not the vagus nerve. General surgeons were making millions of dollars doing vagotomies. I know because I was in residency at the time, so I've done probably 100 vagotomies myself. And I always thought it was the stupidest operation in the world. But nonetheless, that's what we were doing. It's kind of like our version of barber surgery. The interesting thing is the gut of our nearest relatives is not the same as our gut. You would think they would be, but they're not. Barry Marshall had to come up with an idea. How do I prove this since I can't even use a primate model? So what did he do? He drank the Helicobacter himself and then put the snake down his throat and scoped himself to prove that Helicobacter was the cause of it. Here's the interesting thing. When the biophysicists looked at Helicobacter emits 200 to 400 nanometer light. That's very different than the bifidobacteria that Dr. Hazan just mentioned about COVID. Then when you do fecal transplants, because remember where Dr. Hazan is going there, that's from the cecum where the appendix is, which is kind of your accessory microbiome, distal to your asshole. What a fecal transplant is really doing is only activating that part of the colon. So it appears that there's three different parts of the gastrointestinal tract from a decentralized network that's important. And it turns out the part that Barry Marshall really taught us about was the lower esophageal sphincter is really important to create the amount of acid, and the only bacteria that really can persist in this area is Helicobacter. And it turns out Helicobacter really is pathologic because it emits ultra weak UV light that's very detrimental to the myelin of the vagus nerve. And that creates a very interesting conundrum. One of the things that Dr. Hazan has talked about on her social media feeds that I've noticed she's picked up on, and it was a very wise point, but unfortunately most of the idiots and influencers out there don't really put these things together. The use of methylene blue orally actually is one of the things that destroys Bifidobacter. And I've gone out of my way to tell people multiple times when I went back into the ICUs and COVID over the last 5 years, I never used methylene blue orally. In fact, part of the reason I didn't do that is because I knew about the link. And I believe that the real key to Bifidobacter is what Alexis just brought up. It's emitting a specific frequency. Do I have a prediction of what that frequency is to generate the healing Freights, or I should say Becker's regenerative current in the gut? Yeah, I think that it's probably between 400 and 800 nanometer light. It's possible it could go up higher, but as I told Alexis on multiple podcasts we've done, I don't have a photomultiplier that I can actually put inside of these cells. And Dr. Hazan, you need to know a little bit about Fritz Popp, who's the guy that really opened this field. He's a biophysicist, a physicist by training, very smart. He's got a little bit of a bad rep in the biophysics world because of some of the science that he did wasn't as tight as it could have been back in the 60s and 70s, but that still doesn't, detract from what he found. The key point that he found that you need to know in your research, why you're at the screen level and why I'm at the projector level, that prokaryotes release 5,000 times more light than eukaryotic cells. So the reason I use the analogy between you and I is realize that tells us that the interior of the gut lining, is the screen that the microbiome releases its light show on. And it turns out the light show is what gives you the movie. And it sounds like, as a GI clinician, you're very interested in the movie. And you can see the difference between you and I. It's not that I don't like the movie. I like to understand how the movie was made. And the reason why I think the movie being made is important for people, so that when you sit them down and they have C. difficile from the transverse mesocolon down, then it will make sense why they'll sign a consent form for you to allow you to do a fecal transplant. The flip side of that, and I think several of my tribe members know, I have a farm member, not a farm member, but a member who actually did a fecal transplant and became acutely psychotic from it. So when I tell people that you need to fully understand the light story, this is the reason why. Why? Because if you don't understand the decentralized anatomy of the gut from top part, middle part, bottom part, and then realize that part of the light show that you mentioned, POMC on the rectus, remember there's a enterochromaffin organ in your gut that controls a lot of different things, not only peristalsis, but also comes from POMC. It's called the organ interlandal. A lot of people don't know it's a neural crust derivative. That is one of the main targets of the biophotons on there. And the last time, I'll shut up after this to let you guys talk a little bit. The last podcast I did with Alexis, I tried to make a comment to a guy named Scott that we have the idea that sunlight coming on our bodies is the only way light comes in. And that is a very diffused light. It's strong, it's powerful, but it's diffused. The flip side is when you go down to the nano, atto, or femto levels, which is where we are in the microbiome, that biophotons, while they have low intensity, they don't appear to be powerful. Remember, what controls the electromagnetic force? Photon is the force carrier. As scale shrinks, photons get stronger. So guess what you should understand if you're a doctor doing the research you're doing? That means ultra-weak biophotons are stronger than sunlight. Now do a hard stop, because I know that you learned all the things I did in the proximal gut. That explains to you why serotonin is sitting in the gut and why it controls peristalsis. Why? It's made out of aromatic amino acids that are programmed by light. If you look at the absorption and emission spectra,
Yeah.
200 to 4 nanometer light. That's not light that the sun has. So that brings us to the point right before I started yapping. Where the hell does that light come from if it's not from the sun? And that is why this story, in my opinion, is important, but it's also the reason why centralized medicine has the story all wrong.
Something had clicked for me because when I was studying the microbiome when I was at Princeton proximally, because I had some colleagues working on it, but I learned from them that so many of the metabolites made by the microbiome were from tryptophan or phenylalanine, which are these aromatic amino acids that just so happen to absorb UV light like crazy, especially in the UVC range or the very high frequency UVB range as well, and can emit in the UVA range. And it's like there are these. I started conceptualizing when I found Jack's work that these molecules, these metabolites can actually be shuttles for light. Like that could actually be their primary function. We don't really know because those aren't the
That's exactly what hormones are. If
right.
you look at, remember, I've tried to tell people on Twitter, and I would tell Dr. Hazan to do the same thing, because maybe her jump into this, where she'll get interested, every single hormone that's linked to the anterior posterior pituitary has an absorption and emission spectra. Just do a hard stop, whether you know it or not. This is what I'm saying, Dr. Hazan. Whether you believe in evolution or God, why the fuck would anybody put an absorption and emission spectra on there? And then when it gets really crazy, why is the absorption and emission spectra different than the terrestrial spectra of sunlight? That's when you got to really start to say, wait a minute, are we missing something really, really foundational? Because if you understand what I'm saying, when you stick the snake up someone's ass or down their throat and you don't have this perspective, you're like, wait a minute, this is like an airplane being rebuilt in the air flying from Los Angeles to New York. Are we really knowing what we're doing? And when patients sign the consent form, they need to understand this. They need to understand where the state of centralized GI is, centralized microbiome research. And that's where, I think you're important and Alexis is important. Why? Because you're not an influencer. You're actually a doctor. So is Alexis. She's a doctor. It's not like these idiots in the wellness space that tell you all this nonsense about supplements, about probiotics, and all that bullshit.
Yeah.
And this is really important, that I think that the state or the edge of where centralized science is and where Uncle Jack is in decentralized science, and I put Alexis somewhere in the middle of that, having discussions between people that really, truly have put the time in to do the proof of work to see where they're going. Because I understand what you're doing. As an actively practicing gastroenterologist, you have people coming in with sort of colitis and all different kinds of dysbiosis. I get it. But at the same time, we have a duty to keep pushing the envelope forward and say, maybe we don't have all the answers yet.
100%. And by the way, I totally agree with you. So when a patient comes to me, they usually come to me because they've seen 20 doctors and nobody can help them. So they come into the research realm, which is there in clinical trials that you can help me with, Dr. Hazan, right? If there's nothing in clinical trials, then you have to kind of like look outside. My outside right now is the microbiome. But you're absolutely right. When you say a patient that did fecal transplant and got psychosis, I don't know why I'm frozen, but anyways, a patient got psychosis. Can you still hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
So when psychosis, it tells you there's a component of donor stools that is non-compatible. There's a component of something.
But think about what I just said to you. There's another part of this. That's why I said this to you. There's another part that you missed.
And
What
that's
happens
what
if the patient is demyelinated? What happens if your patient that you stick the snake in is demyelinated? You put those good
100%.
bacteria in, and all of a sudden those mitochondria are still making a different frequency. And that different frequency, as you know, that's going through the portal vein into the liver and straight up to the brain. And remember, anybody, this is the big part that nobody talks about, anybody who goes to see Dr. Hazan or Dr. Kruse, let's be clear about this. The gut barrier is wide open. The blood-brain barrier is also. So whatever happens in your asshole is actually happening in your brain, and whatever happens in your brain is happening in your asshole.
And that, by the way, is why I went rogue from pharma. Because remember, I'm the girl that was getting paid millions to do clinical trials from pharmaceutical companies and bringing new drugs to market. When fecal material became a pill, without understanding this simple concept of not everybody can be matched, not everybody should have stools from one person to another. We're all different, right? I mean, you have the Amazon jungle. It's so funny because when I went into this field of fecal transplant, people started thinking, oh, well, diversity, we've lost diversity in America. Let's get the diversity from Africa or the Amazon jungle. No, you can't do that. You've destroyed your gut. Generations and generations in America, you've depleted not only your your microbiome, but you've depleted your colonocytes to accept these microbes, right? So therefore, you're not going to be doing well with a microbiome from another place that has diversity. So this is what got me into this. It was really the what I saw in medicine was, and what I was culprit to for years, bringing these products to market, not really thinking, is that we've really globalized humanity. We've really globalized the world to basically say, one pill for all, one shot for all. Think about what we did with these vaccines.
Well, that's what centralization is all about. I mean, that's the whole point. When you said, that's why I call it centralized medicine. What you just use as a synonym, which is globalism. And that's the reason why I brand biophysics decentralized medicine.
And it needs to be decentralized because that's how we start thinking. That's how we start like asking questions. That's how we bring back science to being science, right? Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're wrong. Either way, we need to keep moving because that's how we find the answers. When you see a patient with fecal transplant who got psychosis, you have to say, what is going on there? And you have to say, wait, stop. Something's going on. So Colleen Kelly, I described, showed 2 cases of alopecia areata that improved the fecal transplant. On the flip side, I have 2 patients that went to Germany and went to the Bahamas or wherever and got alopecia totalis from the fecal transplant. So for everything that looks like a miracle and is a cure, it causes the same problem, right? The same thing that can improve Alzheimer's that I saw in one patient, remember it's an N of 1, can also cause Alzheimer's in an N of 1 somewhere down the road. So to embark on this field and to say, yeah, it's all about fecal transplant, let's talk shit, this and that. No, that's never my intent. My intent, actually, to be quite honest, is to understand further than right now my life. I want to understand what these microbes are doing when they're decomposing our guts. Remember, bacteria decomposes the body and puts us back into the earth. Think about this. Bacteria is still alive. The bacteria that you've been carrying for 20, 30, 50, 60 years that is decomposing your body, breaking down your bones, your skin, and putting you back into the earth is still alive. It's still doing something. And it's still, yes, probably creating a light and probably creating secretions to keep on moving, to keep on restructuring the planet, the soil. The idea that feces or microbes just stays in our gut and that's it, that's the end. No, it goes into the earth. Are we destroying the earth because of the fact that we've globalized the planet into basically having the same microbes all over when really you're supposed to have a diversity of microbes in different regions? That's why different regions have different temperatures. That's why different regions are growing different fruits and plants. and even have different sunlights, right? Different exposure to sun. So the idea of controlling the sun, the idea of, that's just barbaric. That's just criminal, in my opinion. We have to understand, we have to push, the science to say, why is that patient psychotic from fecal transplant? Why is that patient not psychotic? And what microbes are doing what? I will tell you that, in my opinion, for every microbe, there is an equal that is doing something positive, there is an equal microbe doing something negative. And the key is for these microbes. Think about COVID. I hypothesized that in order to survive COVID, you needed to have high Bacillobacterium and high Bifidobacteria and high diversity, because that's what we found in a 70 patient study looking at the highly exposed versus the severe COVID. Now, is that the answer to neutralizing the virus that is causing the problem? Maybe, but I think to every microbe, there's a neutralizing microbe. There's an equal microbe that neutralizes it. And the same thing then becomes, is that microbe secreting air? Is that microbe secreting, light versus the other one? So I think that's how we have to start looking at it and start looking more at how do we achieve the balance? Is the light the source to bring the balance back, right? Is that energy?
Well, that's what I think the key is. I mean, a couple ideas that you brought up there that I want to bring up. Your idea about one bug versus one bug, believe it or not, that's a physics basis. That's matter and antimatter. That's actually where you're going.
Right.
But here's the big one. Alexis and I just did a podcast, a couple of days ago, where I mentioned to her something about aspirin, acetaminophen, minocycline, or lithium. When we in medicine look in our PDRs and we see there's no biochemical mechanism, I told Alexis that's proof positive that you have a biophysical mechanism at work. And that's the reason why centralized medicine is blinded to it. You just pointed that out actually with fecal transplants, because when you see patients get better and repair their alopecia areata, and then other patients get it, what did you just learn? You just learned that it's got to be a biophysical mechanism just by first principle thinking. And see, that is the key. That's the point. Unfortunately, when you're involved in these FDA trials, they actually will try to extinct first principle thinking in doctors. Like, why would you say that? No, we have to do testing. What people don't understand is that light works on fundamental laws of nature, okay? That means they're not subject to randomized controlled clinical trials. They're actually subject to us thinking about them a little bit differently than we have before. And when you said what you said, I didn't want to interrupt you because you're on a good flow. The point that I want to make to people is that is proof positive that biophysics is going. The last point I'll make to you is the amount of oxygen. And I know you don't know this, but I know Alexis does. The amount of oxygen determines how much light's made. Why? ROS actually is highly powered. That makes the ultra weak UV biophotons when you don't have as much ROS, which is what happens down in the distal gut where it's 10 to the 14th. The biophoton window is probably like 400 to maybe 800. It's small. So this is the reason why the enterochromaffin cells, meaning on the lesser and greater splanchnic nerves, the myelin is different. Why the myelin is bigger on the top part of the gut, because you begin to realize the myelin is a proxy for the mitochondria. The mitochondria is where the light is made. So the microbiome is interacting with all these different things to make the movie that you are going to see in your clinic. And the problem is I'm like the guy in California that's saying, wait a minute, we need this light, we need that light, and we need to understand where the light's coming from. And that's where the biophysics that Pop found out, like Alexis will tell you, I've got into huge fights with some of the biophysicists and guys like Michael Levin from Tufts and telling them, what do you mean we don't know this? Of course we know this. It's obvious that we know this. The problem is, because it's not in their centralized paradigm, they believe absence of evidence is absence of effect. And what you're saying is that there's no absence of effect. My patients are coming in and their hair's falling out, or they're crazy, or they got COVID.
Right.
And goes to your original point that when I did that talk that you were talking about, it was in Vermont with Jeff Leach and Zach Bush, who used to steal money from people over probiotics. Jeff Leach told people, I went to Equatorial Africa. I fed people Fanta, antibiotics, Big Macs, and Hershey bars, and I checked their shit, and their shit was perfect. Everything that I believed to be true in Texas turned out when I was at the equator wasn't true. None of those things changed their microbiome. So then I asked him from the stage, I said, Jeff, what do you think might happen if we take the Hazda or the Maasai and bring them to Texas? He goes, well, after seeing this result, he goes, I think their shit may change. I'm like, now you're beginning to understand how light sculpts the microbiome. And he looked at me, and remember, Sabina, this is in 2018. This is a long time ago.
Right.
I've been on this for a really long time, but you know what the problem is? When people are ossified in their positions, it's really hard to get them out because those biases have you locked up.
I think it's not. I think it's really what you're seeing is the essence of science. And I think people, and as scientists, we tend to be really in love with our hypothesis, right? And we tend to want to see that being factual, right? So I think that's mostly what
Can I ask you, is that science? Is that science or is that pseudoscience to you?
Science, because you're still like looking at your hypothesis. Remember, when you look back at Antoine Béchamp and Pasteur, one was all about sterilizing and the other one was terrain health, right? Now, we tended to follow Pasteur because it was better sold, right? It was a better marketing. You could make a
I will
better
tell you, it was
business.
this. Right. It's
The economy keeps the world going as well. So, we're getting into this world of like, do we stop the economy, but then people are going to starve? Do we continue? What makes sense, right? So it's a philosophical question, in my opinion. Is it better to starve and to be healthy and live longer than to be rich and live shorter? I don't know. That's a people's choice. But here's the thing. When you look at Pasteur and you look at Béchamp, Pasteur ended up becoming, what we follow, right? Kill the bug, kill the microbiome, sterilize. I mean, to every day, patients come to me and they're like, well, my doctor put me on doxycycline for a year and I'm on this metal toxicity and I'm taking parasites cleansing. And I'm like, look, you're coming to me to bring back those microbes so the microbes do what they're supposed to be doing, okay? And I don't have all the answers, but I know some things on how to at least improve the bifidobacteria, right? But here's the thing. Pasteur he was, stuck on his idea and everybody followed him. Beish was stuck on his idea and certain people followed him. I tend to look at who lived longer, right? When scientists are following, certain mantra, I'm like, well, who lived longer? If you look at Pasteur, he lived in his 60s. If you look at Béchamp, he lived in his 90s. I'll tend to follow Béchamp, right? So when people try to sell me an idea, somebody was telling me about black seed oil. And I said, gee, I wonder what it's doing to the microbiome. Is it destroying the microbiome? Yeah, it's probably destroying the virus, but is it destroying the microbiome? And then one of the things is the person that started the whole black seed oil, they died in their 60s. So again, who do I want to follow? I want to follow the guy that's lived the longest because honestly, this is where the answer is probably. It's kind of like what we saw during COVID. Everybody was following the guy who was reading the data and showcasing the article. Nobody was following the doctor who lost no one during the pandemic. I mean, I lost no one during the pandemic. What was my secret? Bifidobacteria, So here's the thing. Why do we keep following these scientists, right? Do we call them crazy? Do we call them like full of themselves selling a product? The problem is that, there is a division in the world. And that division is exactly what you kind of pointed out, which is the division that allows the marketing to occur, right? Controversy sells. Marketing 101, the more why Trump went so, is so popular, okay? Because he's so polarized. People are talking about him that hate him, and they really, really hate him, and people are talking about him that love him. Talk about division, talk about polarization, right? But what has the guy mastered? The art of making a deal and the art of selling, because people are still talking about him, right? So I think that's the thing we need to, when we talk about decentralizing, is to stop that division, to come together, to unite, to say this is for the better good of humanity, and to also kind of say, well, Pastor had some ideas of maybe there's some, you need to sterilize it in some cases. And Béchamp had some ideas, maybe bring them together, right? Because I think to think, like, as I look at the microbiome, that it's not a sterilizing, and it's not. When I do fecal transplant, what do? I kill the bad bugs, if you want to call them the bad bugs, because there's just too many of them. And then I bring back the good bugs. So what am I doing? I'm blasting the microbiome and I'm boosting the microbiome, right? That was my idea. That's an idea that I saw from C. diff. What are we doing with C. diff? We're killing the bug and then we're reimplanting multiple microbes to bring back the diversity, a term that I coined, refloralization. Why refloralization? Because we're really bringing back the flora, the microbes that are outside, inside, so we don't reject them anymore. To me, immunity, when I look, and granted, I'm that scientist that's kind of tunnel, focused on the microbiome. I want to branch out. I want to bring in the light. I want to bring in, you talked about Zach Bush. I'm actually doing studies on ion. I'm going to be looking, and we're sponsoring it because, because here's a guy that told me, Sabine, I've improved autism with this product. I don't think he would lie about it. Okay. And he's improved cancer with this product. I said, okay, well, you know what? Let me see. Because I see something. I see a marker, a signal in the microbiome that kind of guides me. I want to bring all this to the picture. I don't want to be the girl that's like Béchamp or Pasteur. I want to be the girl in the middle that's open-minded and that says, you know what? Yeah, Jack is right on the money when it comes to light and all that. And Zach maybe have found some archaea bacteria that is helping us, become resilient. Who knows? I think that all of it kind of works as long as we are open-minded to see all the possibilities. It's when there's that dogma, but we saw during the pandemic, of everybody line up. No data. We're not going to listen to Jack. We're not going to listen to Sabine because they're like outliers. They're destroying the narrative. Everybody should be lining up. That's when we have a problem. We had a problem in science when they tried to convince us, and you know better than me, that you could just put a vaccine in the deltoid and it stays in the deltoid. I mean, sure had everybody wake up in the medical field. But here's why they didn't wake up. They were afraid to be divided. They were afraid to be caught in that right or left and be a Jack Kruse or be a Zach Bush or Sabine Hazan or an Andy Wakefield. Nobody wants to be Dr. Wakefield, right? But Dr. Wakefield brought on a very important finding. And that was the finding that kids with autism have a microbiome dysbiosis. He observed it originally. And we're showing it now. Dr. Adams is showing it. I'm showing it. I just had two identical twins, nonverbal, that I started working with in July of 2024, are now fully verbal. So it is possible to go from that nonverbal aggressive to fully verbal, happy, and reading books, right? So what does that tell you when you do that? And all you did is change the microbiome. The microbiome is important. Why did we harass Andy Wakefield. Why did we call him a fraud? Because he had a hypothesis that, you know, kids with dysbiosis had that autism was a gut dysbiosis, that autism was probably linked to Crohn's. And go even further, because what I've seen from my research is not only was he right, but autism is actually an extraintestinal manifestation of Crohn's disease. So, we tend to brand ourselves into Crohn's because I was, a doctor that came up with the idea of Crohn's. And we all focus, well, Crohn's is this and it's an inflammatory. And the only way to fix it is, biologics, $10,000 a month for the rest of their lives. These poor little kids are getting injected at $10,000 a month so that their symptoms are decreasing. But then what's the mental status of a kid that has Crohn's disease and that is doing a biologic and reminded every day that he's a patient? I mean, what's that quality of life in that kid? To me, we need to be better. We need to start saying, okay, well, let's look into Crohn's. Let's see what are the causes, So that's where I'm at. And I try not to stay controversial. That's probably why I'm silenced as much as possible, because I'm a people lover. I'm a uniter. I, respect of diversity, respect of different races, respect of the microbiome. That's who I am in essence. So, but I love what you're doing, and that's it. I'm going to stop speaking because I tend to blah blah.
Yeah, I want to chime in quick because there's a few threads to pull on. I mean, I think if we boil it down, it seems like most, at least physicians, didn't stand up for their patients and say no to these experimental injections because they were risking their paycheck if they would do that. And I mean, I think Jack talks about this. I think it's over 90% of physicians are employed by some hospital system. They're not self-employed. And so if they go out on that limb, they're risking.
Remember one other thing, though, Alexis. That is true. I'm going to give both of you, that's the top pick. But what's the next thing below it that I think Dr. Sabin can talk a little bit about as well? Is that doctors are treated or they treat by algorithm. Yeah. And the algorithm is the benefit of big pharma.
They're also trained by algorithm too. Is that, I mean, it's very cut and dry.
And I'll go even further. The algorithm was created by the lawyers who are the lobbyists for pharma.
Correct. And that's the point that I'm trying to make.
And the lawyers made the doctors scared because remember, I learned this early on in my career where, if you're afraid of a lawsuit, then you stop practicing. You start following the dogma. You start following the guidelines because you don't want to deviate from that box because God help you, if you're sued, you're deviating, right? I personally think if you have an informed consent with the patient and the patient understands you're doing research, you're protected up to a point. But what I've learned also is we as doctors do not fight the lawyers. That's the problem. We, get these lawsuits and we settle for them and we get all panicky because of that. At the end of the day, it's a shit show in the courtroom. You just have to say your case. And inevitably, if a doctor speaks his mind, says, listen, I've tried to help the patient. I wasn't afraid of a lawsuit during COVID because I felt, look, these people are dying. They don't want to go to the hospital. They feel like they're going to die in the hospital. I have no choice. I'm going to save them. And I'm not going to worry about being sued by one of those patients because they understand. First of all, they sign an informed consent. So the informed consent told them what I'm doing with them.
But Sabine, think about Mary. Think about what's going on with Mary. This is a totally different paradigm. The hospital is going after her, and then the hospital called the Texas Medical Board to go directly after her license. So the point I'm trying to make to you, you're giving the audience one path. There's a different path. This is the paradigm coming directly after the doctor who's done everything right. In fact, I would submit to you that she's done less wrong than anybody trying to help a dying patient. And what is the paradigm effectively telling everybody? We don't want doctors to go off the algorithm. Stick to the recipe all the time. And what happens when you get off the recipe. That's when you engage first principle thinking. My belief, first principle thinking is science. Anything, like you made a comment before that I wanted to strangle you, but I didn't, about whoever lives longer is wiser. Let me tell you something. I don't think it's who lives longer. You know what I think the most important part is? Whose ideas have more substantivity to poison the well. For example, we had Newton for 500 years before we had the little guy with the funny hair show up in Switzerland and say, hey, you know what? Time isn't absolute. Time is relative. So now we have another shit show because we can't figure out how quantum mechanics and relativity mix together. So, and he's already dead, and we don't have anybody else to actually think. I would tell you, and this is what I submit, I think the ideas that last longer, there's an idea in money that I think Alexis is beginning to learn. It's called the Lindy effect. That's happening right now with Bitcoin and fiat. We've used fiat money for a long time because it's worked, but it doesn't mean it's right. And we now know it's not right. And Bitcoin is one of the solutions to that. But Bitcoin doesn't have the Lindy effect yet. And when you said, hey, Pasteur died before Beauchamp, let's go that to me is a little bit of a logical fallacy when we're talking about science. And the reason I interrupted you here is because when you were talking, I was like, wait a minute. We've got a friend in Mary who is fighting for her patients just like I do and you do. And remember, I was in a meeting with Nicole, Andy Wakefield, and Mary not even 6 months ago on Twitter talking about this because guess what? We were the council of the canceled, but we were canceled 3 different ways from the paradigm.
Yes.
Okay. And we need to understand how the canceling is happening because guess what? It's always covert to protect the centralization in the system. That's the lawyers. That's big pharma. That's the hospital system. And you need to realize when you get your license renewal in California, who's controlling really you? The Medical Practice Act of California. Well, they're weaponizing that against Mary right now. So doctors, and this is what patients need to understand, doctors do have rules like bowling alleys do. If the ball goes in the alley, you're going to get in trouble. Decentralized medicine says something a little bit different. The ball may go in the alley at times, but you have to understand that when you stay rolling the ball down with centralized medicine, sometimes they're missing some boards and the ball could go right through the ground and you're not going to get better. Why? Because in your state right now, we went from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 27 in autism. If you think anybody in the fucking state of California
my state
has got the message loud and clear, no, none of them understand how the light in the environment is sculpting the microbiome, and those microbiome is changing its light story. That's the real story behind autism. That's the real story. That's the story that I punched Nicole in the mouth about. And are you correct that when you go and sample the microbiome that you are going to find a problem? You're never going to get a question from me about that because I'm telling you the microbiome is the projector that makes the light. That's the point.
Speaking of canceled scientists and like the light in the environment, I wanted to make sure I brought up Becker here because in The Body Electric, obviously he got canceled in like the 70s, but in The Body Electric, he talks about how non-native EMFs change bacterial growth. And so, that's obviously an issue today with 5G, 4G, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi.
60s. Put that out there.
60s. It's been 60 years.
Predates both of us. And guess what? We are still dealing with that cancellation.
Yeah.
And if you really want to take it back, COVID, the big cancellation is Bernie Setti.
Yes.
He gets canceled. That's the reason why we have S40 in the vaccines now. But that's the point I guess I'm trying to make to Dr. Hazan. Everybody, decentralized science is everybody's ideas come to the table. And then what do? This shouldn't be kumbaya. This should be, we should fucking fight it out, blood death, just like you do in a meeting. If somebody gets up at a medical meeting in neurosurgery and says something and I say it's bullshit, I go grab the microphone and say, you are full of fucking shit. This is absolute garbage. Because guess what? That's what we did in M&M conference. That's exactly what we do behind
You
closed
know what,
doors.
Ms. Jack, you're a type A personality that's very strong, and there are other people that are not as strong, and that's intimidating, right? I mean, it's like the lion and the tiger and the elephant, different animals, right? So you're a very strong, powerful person. You're going to fight because you're Viking blood, probably. But the other person is not as strong and is very sensitive. So we have to come to the table at some point and hash it out and see what I'm seeing, see what you're seeing, and kind of bring it together. Because I would say that all of this was supposed to happen so we could come to the table. In a way, we are coming to the table because would have never talked to you about light, and you would have never talked about my microbiome, and we would have been completely different. And but by coming to the table, by uniting, people like Nicole, people like Andy Wakefield, people like Mary, we support each other. What Mary needs more than anything to fight what's happening to her in Texas is really that union, uniting doctors. And I think ultimately doctors are going to be patients. You know how many doctors I have whose kids have autism and are calling me to help them? So they've come to the table. The beauty of the microbiome for me anyways, and I'm sure for you also with the light, you bring doctors to the table to start seeing the light, to be quite honest. You brought me to the table, I paid attention, and here we are today, right? I think it's important to keep bringing them to the table. We're still not done. We're in a war. I mean, Pierre Corey, however people feel about Pierre, said to me at the beginning, because I was the girl that actually thought at the beginning of the pandemic, I could bring a product to market like pharma. I could be on the next you know, pharmaceutical company. But what happened was my training, my heart did not want to develop. And I called Pierre and I said, Pierre, if you have an idea about, how to treat COVID, then patent it and develop it as a product. And he said to me, he goes, Sabine, we're at war. I don't think you realized it. And he's right. I didn't realize it. You know when I realized it? Because I was the girl that brought drugs to market for pharma. I realized it when my clinical trials were censored. When I could advertise for a psoriasis clinical trial and put $10 on Facebook and I would get 100 patients, and I would put $100 on Facebook on join the high Z-Pack vitamin C, D, and zinc protocol, and nobody would answer, and we were censored. We couldn't even advertise. My credit card was no longer good for Facebook, right? So that was one realization. Two was the lies. Three was when they started attacking my papers. And these are papers that I've, written with the Department of Health. By the way, the Department of Health came after my license as well. And I said to them, I said, why are you here? We're under jurisdiction of the FDA. I wrote all those protocols. I mean, like I went above and beyond not to be, treating, as a physician, which, by the way, the Helsinki Declaration allows doctor to treat, so you don't need the FDA to treat. So Mary was supposed to treat. That Helsinki Declaration protects her as a physician to treat. So no board should be coming after her. No, no. All they're doing is basically
But it
cranking
is.
up.
That's the
Yeah,
sad
because
part. It
they
is.
figured out they can crank up the legal, and it's lawyers talking with each other and using her to just crank up the bill, because that's what it is at the end of the day. If I go to court, I'm not having a lawyer. I'm going straight up, and it's going to be the shit show. So and that's what it needs to be. Unfortunately, it needs to be a shit show when you're fighting and you're at war. You have to, kind of kill the opponent that way. Um,
So you do agree with Jack
was a
Kruse.
huge away.
What you're saying is you do agree with my technique, because that's exactly what I do.
That's survival, right? I mean, you're a lion. You're absolutely,
And
and
I
that's
would submit it to you, Sabine. I think Mary is as big a
pure
lion
bear.
as me,
Pure bear.
but she's as big a lion or bear as I am. You know what the difference is? She looks better than me. She's got nicer hair, nicer makeup, But the thing is, the same thing in my DNA is in her DNA. And to be honest with you, I think she needs to fight them even harder and go after it. And what she's doing and how she's weaponizing the public to realize what the Texas Medical Board's doing and the people that are in politics that are actually helping them do it. All doctors and all patients should be united on this front. Why? Because this is a personal attack on your sovereignty. You need to understand that.
100%. I mean, hey, if they came after her, they will come after you too.
Absolutely.
So, and they will come after you when you're trying to fix your kid, okay? And you're going to be enraged because your kid is autistic and you didn't do anything about it before, you diagnosed your kid.
That's exactly what's happening with Nicole right now in California.
Well, I know. So it's yes, so we have to fight. There's no other choice. But at the same time, if you're coming to the table to talk scientific, I think we need to bring in the doctors. I think, and also what I realized this pandemic is we all had a role. You have a role. Mary has a role to showcase the corruption at the medical board and at the hospital. You know what my role is? To showcase the corruption of the medical journals and the publishing houses that are going above the peer reviewers. Okay, think about it. When a hypothesis is retracted by an investor criticized my hypothesis, an investor that had a patent probably in the microbiome space, an investor that probably he didn't like the fact that I was shaking his beehive of whatever stocks he was supporting for his clientele, right? So that investor went to the publishing house directly and harassed the publishing house to retract a hypothesis. And guess what? I have no rebuttal. I cannot even fight them in court. I cannot even go after that publishing house because it's a private publishing house that controls all the journals. But you know what I can do? I can make phone calls. I can call all my colleagues and friends from academia and say, by the way, you've been reviewing all these papers all these years, not getting paid for it. And guess what? Your papers, they don't even care about your opinion. They're retracting the paper above your opinion. Why are you doing it at no pay? So that's how you wake up the world. That's our mission. My mission is to showcase that.
So you realize that that's part of the thing that I'm building in El Salvador. That's actually what we're going after. See, my role in this is to take all the different pieces and parts. What's happening to you, what's happening to Mary, understanding what's going on in DC. I'm getting to sit down with the guys that are making all these rules and explaining to them, this is how it needs to be taken apart, using zero knowledge proofs, taking the Maxwell family out of the equation of controlling centralized science so that way science can be decentralized. I've sat down with Jay Bhattacharya, okay? I've sat down with Martin Koldorf. I've sat down with Kevin McKiernan. Like, I can tell you who I've talked to. Bobby Kennedy, Trump, Bukele, Nicole, Senator Ron Johnson. Like, they know where I'm at. But I told them that I'm no quarter on this issue with the jabs. We cannot continue to give children these jabs and then expect families in California to run to your clinic to fix the microbiome when the fucking real answer is stop fucking injecting the kids. It's really simple. It's not hard.
At the very least, do the research to showcase, You don't
even need the research. Enough of the research has already been done.
No, your RNA vaccine. Personally, that's a disaster. That was a disaster from day one. It's a contaminated vaccine. We know it. You know it. Kevin knows it. It definitely, it's interesting because here we are coming to the same table again, me and Kevin. And Kevin, by the way, for those who don't know, was in the original microbiome project at the NIH with Francis Collins. So this guy is He's already made history because I was sitting at a museum. My feet were killing me, and I was sitting at a video on the microbiome, and lo and behold, Francis Collins starts talking about the microbiome, and then Kevin McKernan starts explaining how they process these samples, etc. So I'm like, wow, he's already in the museum. He's already made history. This guy is legit. But when he came out with the whole SB40, I actually hired David Speaker from Toronto, flew him to my lab because we had vaccines, and I said, let's test the vaccines. And sure enough, we did find contamination. So, that contamination is an explanation to what I saw with the messenger RNA killing the bifidobacteria. It is an explanation to possibly, because we have data coming that loss of bifidobacteria is linked with autism. This is not my own data. Dr. Adams showed the original paper initially that basically showed loss of bifidobacteria in autism. When I focus on treating kids with autism, that's my focus, is improving the bifidobacteria. So if you put two and two together, right, and you look at all this, you go, okay, well, contaminated vaccine, loss of bifidobacteria, loss of bifidobacteria in kids with autism. I'm fixing kids with autism with bifidobacteria, improving them, and showcasing zero bifidobacteria. Like these two identical twins, by the way, had the same identical microbes present before and then after it disappeared, those microbes that most likely were the culprit of their autism, going up and down the vagal nerve, as you were talking about. But here's the other thing. The loss of bifidobacteria in both twins was zero at baseline. And then by improving the bifidobacteria, their speech improved, correlating with clinical with the lab, right? The marker, the signal. So when you see that, you have to kind of say, okay, we have a problem. I tend to say to people, eventually, obviously I'm still at the projector, I'm not, at the
Just
screen.
remember, bifidobacteria, what I want to get you to is bifidobacteria is a red light story. That's what the microbes are making. So guess what? When I sat down and wrote the blog that I wrote for Nicole, that convinced her to write a $20 million check to Francisco Gonzalez Lima in Texas to study the effect of red light in autism. Why? Because what I'm trying to do is take what you're finding in the clinic, what you're finding in your papers, and then I'm giving you the biophysics behind it. Because you remember, this is the methodology really to the papers that you're doing. And that is the point that I've tried to make to Alexis, that I need her to put down all the biochemistry bullshit and let's get down to the dirty basics. And the dirty basics are every single bacteria in the microbiome actually has an absorption and emission spectra. That's what we need to start to study. So then Alexis can turn around to Sabine and say, look, this is what we think this disease really has a problem with. So we want you to take your scope, put this in their ass, and let's see how it goes from there. And then we write the paper and do it in decentralized fashion. My point is that I need someone like you at some point in 5 to 10% of your time to sit back and go, okay, I need to learn about Fritz Pop. I need to learn about biophysics. I need to understand. No one ever told me prokaryotes make 5,000 times more light than eukaryotes. If that's the case, then Jesus Christ, that's got to have some type of effect, because I know that all the microbiome that I spend my whole day playing with, it's basically a light show. And I don't know what the light show is about. It's like I'm watching Close Encounters with the Third Kind and have no idea what the alien's trying to tell me.
Yeah, and by the way, that's actually a brilliant experiment, because eventually what you could do is improve the bifidobacteria with the light.
Correct.
And something,
You already said that. You don't realize you already said it in the beginning. That's the idea that I gave Jeff Leach about getting POMC on the rectus. But guess what? There's another effect. Once you hit POMC on the rectus, that's the first step in the movie. But then you've got to create the light show from the microbiome on the enterocyte, and then on the enteric nervous system, then on all the different things in the wall of the lumen at that specific place. And then you're going to start to find out, why is it that the gut changes its zip code from LES down to the anus? Well, you're going to find out. The main reason, it's an oxygen story. And guess what oxygen means? That's how you make light. You can't make light without oxygen. And that's the whole point of biophysics. That's what Roland Van Wyck, that's what Fritz Popp has been saying literally for 60 years. And guess what? Nobody in centralized clinical medicine has any earthly idea that what I just told you is as basic as your patients are going to die if they can't breathe.
I mean, the other issue too is that none of our experiments in centralized science have any light controls whatsoever. So like the light that we're doing the experiments under are influencing our results. And then we're
Correct.
speaking in absolutisms as if we have figured out a mechanism or, the way to treat something, but we have no idea if like maybe we stuck those people outside instead, in addition to the treatments they're receiving, maybe their results would be even better and even they would achieve them more quickly as well. So that's the thing that I'm really interested in studying in the lab is the light controls.
I said that to Huberman. I said it to Eddie Chang.
Yep.
And the reason I said it is because of what Dr. Hazan said before about what I said to Jeff Leach. Jeff Leach proved this microbiome story in the Hasda and the Maasai. This is an amazing story. This story needs to be studied. Why? Because that could be the reason why there's a big blockade between me, Hazan, you, Nicole. Big Pharma knows that this is an issue, and they need to protect their franchise from us getting to that answer. That is what I think is going on.
Also, with the Hadza and the Maasai, there were also studies done with the Yanomami tribes down in the Amazon, and they saw that they had very interesting diversity within their microbiomes, and they thought it was because of the environment, but then they came back to the States, exposed people to UVB light on their skin, and found, oh shit, this microbe is actually present when you just expose the skin to UVB light. So there's so much more to the story with regards to the light that our bodies are exposed to from the outside in that are actually shaping the microbial communities inside our guts.
Well, you know that because
that would be an easy.
I was just going to say, how many times have I said to people that the skin clocks control the gut microbiome? Why? That circadian biology tells us this is the answer. We already know this. That's why it drives me crazy when I hear people like Narosha or fucking Michael Levin say, oh, we don't need to study. It's fucking obvious. We already know it. Circadian biology tells us this. Can we get to the chase and actually do something that's going to help these kids with autism in California?
So the idea of the red light on bifidobacteria would be actually an easy experiment that we could do in our lab, which is basically put a bunch of petri dish and do in vitro. You put a bunch of bifidobacteria, you put the red light. You could even put blue light. You could put different kinds of light.
Make sure you put it in a Faraday cage in your lab.
That's
That's a big deal. When you
non-native
design
EMFs.
Methodology, you need to get rid of all the non-native.
So Jack, let's create the protocol. Let's do it.
I have no problem.
I want to help.
I have no problem doing that. That's one of the stories we should do. And Alexis, you should send this recording to Nicole.
Yep.
So Nicole can see exactly what we're doing and where we're coming up. Because remember, inside the body, Dr. Saman, this protects all the quantum effects. I know you don't know a lot about biophysics, but in our blood, we have 150 parts per million of deuterium. Deuterium does the same thing it does in a nuclear reactor, protects EMF. So that's a Faraday cage. That means that your gut in your patients always is protected in a Faraday cage. Now, there's another Faraday cage inside the cell because it makes water from mitochondrial metabolism. So if you're sick, for example, when you irradiate with blue light, you make less water in your mitochondria. That means you make worse light, okay? When you have red and purple light, which is UV and red, you make the most water. That means you have the most protection from non-native EMF. So when you do the experiment and you understand that, you're like, okay, since we're trying to help kids with autism, we need to think about this in our methodology in the Petri dish. We need to do the experiment inside a Faraday cage where there's no photons except the photons we're interested in. That's it.
Okay. Yeah,
By the
so
way, deuterium also, in the same way that deuterium can gunk up the mitochondrial engines, it happens the same with bacteria. I pulled a few papers showing that deuterium-laden water will inhibit microbial growth and change their morphology, and that shouldn't be a surprise, of course, because they are the proto-mitochondria, but it's just an important part of the
Alexis,
story.
you remember what I said to Logan Prospertarian when I did his podcast? Remember, he's a farmer. And I said,
Yep,
if you
the
want to
plants.
teach your I said, if you want to teach your kids, because Dr. Sabin, I don't know if you know um this kid, but he's got a kid with cancer that's gotten better with a lot of the stuff that I've taught him. And he's a farmer. And I said, look, he always downs himself, which he shouldn't because he's a smart guy, because he's a farmer. I said, look, this is the experiment I want you to do. Take two plants identical, put them in your yard, leave the sun the same, put one with deuterium depleted water, one without. And guess what you'll find? The one that has deuterium depleted water has a 40% higher yield. Well, the
wow.
reason I say this to you, Dr. Hazen, is I want you to realize that the water that your mitochondria makes in every one of your patients is deuterium depleted. So guess what? When we do the study that you're going to do, one of the phases that happens, we put heavy water and then we put deuterium depleted water while you're radiating with red light. And magically, guess what you're going to see? You're going to see the heteroplasmy rate come down. And then you're going to turn around and say to all the mothers that are really maha moms that have kids with autism, when we do this on your kids, you're going to feed them deuterium depleted water and they're going to use red light. And then you're going to go, wow, this actually can make the autism as fast as it came on after the MMR vaccine is as fast as it can go away. Because what are we effectively doing? We're reverse engineering the great oxygenation event that really is the cause of this issue. Why? Because the more oxygen you have, the more bad light you make. And it turns out the less oxygen you have, and there's a final point that I want to make to Dr. Hazen. I want you to remember something when you did your OBGYN rotation. That little alien in that belly was hypoxic for 9 years and grew tremendously.
For
So
9 months.
9 months.
there's a big story here.
Years.
There's a really big story here that hypoxia and oxygen are the key to this light story. This is the recipe that is in Julia Child's book for the microbiome, and that is the key that we need to study.
Well, we'll start with the light first and then move on to the next experiment. I mean, it certainly would be simple enough to fix. I personally think water makes a big difference, especially when people talk about alkaline water is my least favorite because I tend to think that it kills the microbiome. But yeah, that would be great to see, the effects of a depleted water and the effects of red light, in kids with autism. I mean, there's been studies with red light and Parkinson's. So, and Parkinson's is also a loss of certain microbes and, the whole gut-brain axis pathway being altered. So
That's a
it would
melanin
make
story.
sense that autism would also be the same thing. So
That's another melanin story. When you're hypoxic, you lose melanin. Melanin degrades. Remember what I said in the beginning of this podcast about the organ of interlandal that everybody forgets. That's what the greater and lesser splanchnic nerves are actually effectively doing in your gut. And nobody seems to know that. Like when you stick your scope in someone's ass and you see that they have melanosis coli, that should be a sign to you right away that the neural crest is migrating for a problem related to the microbiome, meaning that the microbiome is making a light that's making this melanin come to the surface when it shouldn't be at the surface.
thing is fascinating about melanin, by the way, because so tell me more about melanin because
This is the key. This is the key with melanin. You need to
I
know.
see patients with vitiligo.
Yeah, well, vitiligo is a big one, but it's tied to this story, and you will find that patients with vitiligo are going to have dysbiosis, but you're going to find that every single neurologic condition and every skin condition. What am I trying to do? Bring you back to embryology. What do you know about skin and brain? Same tissue. So it makes total sense that the light that the microbiome releases would sculpt both organs when you actually think about it like that. Now, the key with melanin, when melanin is hypoxic, it degrades. But what's the biophysics of melanin? Right now, the guys in NASA and ISS want to put it up in space because it's the best electrical conductor. In other words, you can make electricity from sunlight when it's dry. Here's the how we use it, though, is different. It has to be hydrated. And when it's hydrated by deuterium depleted water, it takes the currents that are massive and makes them really, really low. And that current turns out that's what heals everything in the body. That's what Becker functionally found. When Becker did all his stuff in the 60s on bone, this is the most amazing part that I want you to think about. He found that broken bone. When this current comes, it's 1/trillionth of 1 ampere. It takes a red blood cell that has no mitochondria and turns it into methemoglobin. Then it goes from methemoglobin to a fetal red blood cell. What did I just tell you before about a fetus? It's hypoxic. Right. It turns out that that's the stimulus that actually heals the bone. The nucleated red blood cell turns into an osteoclast. It breaks the central law of biology. Remember, they always told us it can only go one way. But what did Becker find in the 60s? That actually you can take an unnucleated red blood cell that's filled with porphyrins that absorb what? Purple and red light, and turn it into another cell by using the smallest current possible. And this is proofed. It's out there. So it's a photobioelectric story. And why do I need you to understand this? Because the people that are coming to you with vitiligo, with alopecia areata, with all these things, what are you effectively doing as a gastroenterologist that's using the microbiome? You are a photobioelectric princess. You don't even know how much part of my tribe you already are. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to show you that what you're doing, I got an idea where the recipe is. And I think the recipe is more important than anything else. Why? Because the better the recipe is, the better the beef bourguignon is going to taste in your clinic in California. That's the point that I've been trying to make really for 20 years for people that have degrees. And unfortunately, the influencers out there take my shit and totally fuck it up. And then patients get hurt. And
yeah, it's kind of like what they did with feces to begin with, too. Exactly. You know, they took the idea of fecal transplant for C. diff and then started selling shit in the market, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, you cannot do that. Or they would essentially teach others. But this is a problem. This is a problem we got to fix, you know. If you don't have the knowledge and if you've not done the research and you've not, you know, you should not be talking and influencing people. You know, some of the worst microbiomes are actually coming from influencers because they see me in patients. So they're selling all these, you know, herbs and products. And I look at the microbiome and I go, wow, this is a completely destroyed microbiome.
Maybe, well, remember, the influencers' canvas is blue light. That's what they did. They're on Instagram. They're on Facebook.
Because they like to kill. It's all about killing. Yes.
That's the point. That's the point I want to make to you, is because I want you to always see the light in the story. The light they're living in is sculpting their microbiome that's hurting them. So that's the reason why that's a really powerful statement for you to see. And then all I want you to do is I don't want you to agree with me. I want you to fight with me and say, Jack, we're going to look at this. And if this turns out to be right, then we need to do more. Then we need to find out more about this, because guess what? The more that we paint by color, the more we paint by frequency, then the smarter our microbiome will get.
Or the better our microbiome will get.
Same. The synonyms are the same. That's why I said we're on the same team. We're on the same team. I just told you, we're seeing the same movie. Yes. You're fascinated with the screen and I'm fascinated with the projector.
Looking at shit and you're looking at red light and beautiful lights. So that's the problem. That's how funny that is, right? So you're in the light, I'm in the shit. Here we come together. You bring shit to the darkness, right? It's funny because I kind of, you know, wondered, like, how am I into this world? You know, me of all people, who's very sterile, not sterile, but who doesn't like to play with shit. But, you know, here we are. You know, we have to bring light to the shit
Well,
to bring light to the darkness. It's kind of beautiful.
I
So
think the ironic
I
thing
mean,
is that it's not actually dark inside. We just don't know because
no,
we're
we
not
don't
measuring it.
see the light.
Yeah,
No,
we can't see it
absolutely.
because
It's
it's
like
being absorbed.
yes,
Yeah, it's
it's
being
like
used.
it's like being in a river and seeing these neon fish that
Right.
light.
It's nutrients. You know what it is? It's nutrients that we don't realize are being utilized. It's kind of like I put a slide out on Instagram actually last night that maybe you guys could take a look at some point because I want you to just get the idea. The visible spectrum and the electromagnetic spectrum only gives you 1/10 billionth of the information. So the way I look at this in the microbiome is the same thing is happening. We're only seeing the part of the story that we see, and we're not realizing that what we don't see is actually the biggest part of the story. It's it's the ultimate Dunning-Kruger effect, that biophysics provides to the biochemistry background. And I think that's the reason why I've been so frustrated for so long, is because this is blatantly obvious. Why isn't anybody looking at it? And I mean, I know the reason why. It's because big pharma controls the game.
And also, but not a lot of people have, curiosity, and not a lot of people have vision, right? Vision is not given to everybody. You see what no one sees. Like, for example, I see the microbiome, like it speaks to me. You see the light, it speaks to you. Not everybody has that ability or that gift. It's frustrating to you because you see it so clearly. And, like I see it so clearly. I mean, to me, I see the microbes, I see the loss of bifidobacteria and Alzheimer's and autism. It makes sense to me. And invasive cancer, it makes sense to me, right? But to someone else, it's foreign. To the CDC, when I showed them my data on high exposed, I never got COVID versus the first thing they said is, why did you look at that? And I said, why look at that? I mean, good science. Why is one person surviving and why is another person not surviving? It makes sense, right? So some people have the vision and some people do not have the vision, unfortunately. So it is frustrating for those of us who have a certain vision to speak our vision, but we have to kind of do it in a way to bring people towards us to understand. And I think, doing the research, saying, let's look at the bifidobacteria and the red light, what it's doing, and doing it methodically with your input, my input, Alexis input, I think brings another piece to the puzzle that, will light up people that will say, what's going on? I'm not going to listen to the politics anymore. And I'm not going to be divided. I'm going to pay attention to the microbiome. That was my whole intent this pandemic because there was so much attention to the politics during COVID, right? Remember, there was so much hatred against Trump. There was so much, talking about Biden, etc. And I'm like, what? Focusing on the politics when there's a big picture here, the microbiome and how to, make a person healthy, right? To me, because we're all going to be patients, right? I opened a multi-million-dollar lab for ProgenaBiome with the interest, not to, I could have retired, from all the money I did from pharma, and be done during the pandemic. But I put my money and my savings into this lab to understand something that could help me in the future because I have the vision to see past my life. I have the vision to see, I had the vision to see if 1 in 20 kid is autistic in California, in 30 years from now, it's going to be 1 in 1. And it's going to be or in 50 years from now, it's going to be 1 in 1. And it's going to be my great grandchild. And I'm not going to be on this planet to fix my great grandchild. So I got to work now to figure out the 100 years. And I am frustrated. I'm moving at a spectacular speed, which is surprising. All the research I've done, to showcase all this, loss of bifidobacteria in Alzheimer's, cancer, the whole, messenger RNA kills the bifidobacteria, the whole, survival of no one dies during the pandemic. I mean, to me, whether you believe in God or not, to me, this was divine intervention to kind of guide me. Or maybe microbiome, maybe light, maybe energy. Maybe I've got a lot more, light microbes than most people. But the fact is, we need to advance to that level. We need to see We need to get people that are looking at the politics and move them to this direction to see the microbiome. And like the influencers are taking on the microbiome. They've gone completely selling all sorts of things. Like, this is a great product for microbiome adjustment to fix microbiome dysbiosis. What is microbiome dysbiosis to begin with? Do we even have an idea? Of course not. So they're just using a term that we created. Of course, because influence brings money, brings marketing, and it's all about who to listen to, who's going to guide you. And at the end of the day, we got to bring people from this way to this way, because this way is what's going to matter to them when they're going to be the patients. And even if they're making this in the stock market, how many stockbrokers are seeing me right now with injuries who have invested in Moderna and Pfizer? And the only thing I can say is you should have invested in the research of the microbiome. You would have gotten a lot farther than investing in some, cockamamie story of, the vaccine stays in the deltoid, or have your French fries with this vaccine. You should have seen beyond. So,
I'm
when
going to
we
tell you it's an extinction level event, because the point that you made before about seeing to the future and thinking about your great grandchild when you're not on the planet, I don't think people right now anywhere in the world really understand that when thinking is destroyed and everybody has autism, that means that we are
gone.
changing humanity, and we may never be able to solve the problems that we can solve today. And, when I say this to people, because trust me, I've said it for a long time, 20 years, people don't like to think about the sixth extinction, but it's going on. And that's
Oh,
exactly what
yes,
autism really is. These
yes.
kids, some
It
of them have
starts with the
amazing,
kid.
right? They have amazing abilities in one part of their life, but that's not what a human is. A human is a generalist, okay? Not a specialist. And that's what the brain is about. It's about being good in a lot of different areas so that you can pick up pattern recognitions. When you have 1 in 27 kids in California having this problem, I can tell you that none of the people in STEMI are going to come from California very shortly. Like the next generation or generation after, like if your doctor went to school in California and they're from California, you probably should find another doctor. That's exactly how I feel.
No, absolutely. And here's what wakes me up in the morning and has me doing this, because I've been nonstop for like, since I opened this, is the realization that we are going extinct. It's not a it's not a an assumption. It's a reality for me, because I see what no one sees, the microbiome. When I analyze 1,000 samples, okay, 1,000 stool samples of people that are like healthy and non-healthy, because we're also trying to look for super donors, right? And when we're analyzing 1,000 samples and one patient has lactobacillus out of 1,000, and less than 5% have bifidobacteria, and actually less than 1% have an adequate level of bifidobacteria, this important microbe that helps break down sugar, that allows sugar to get into your mitochondria, right? When I see that and it's less than 1%, it wakes me up, because then I say, so wait a minute. So I'm a mom, I'm having a baby, I have less bifidobacteria now, I'm depleted. How much less bifidobacteria am I giving to my baby? Now I'm giving my baby 100 vaccines and antibiotics, as we saw the data, that basically shows that every time you vaccinate, a kid has a increased risk of having ear infections. Now they're taking antibiotics. That keeps killing the microbiome. So now these kids are
Remember, California is the microwave oven. That's the point I'm trying to make to you, that you're doing all this in a microwave oven and you don't even realize that the microwave, like you want to know the truth? The first thing on your screening test for a super donor, you know what it should be? What's your screen time in an average day? Because
oh, of course,
what's
of
going to
course,
happen?
of course.
Guess what's going to happen? If they're an influencer, you're never going to use their fucking turds at all.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing. It's California is also the land of Hollywood and marketing and everybody. How many posts did you get on Instagram from the Met Gala? I mean, everybody's talking about the Met Gala. Big whoop,
And also the non-native EMFs and the radar from all the military bases too.
Yeah, it's horrible.
So here's the land of influence is California. Okay, so it's Hollywood. It's everybody wants to live in California. Everybody thinks it's beautiful. Malibu's beautiful until you have a fire or mudslide or whatever. But here's the thing. We don't realize that California is expanding to the rest of America, and the rest of America is expanding to the rest of the world. We are influencing the world to be like us.
At global scale.
Yeah, when you see islands in Kiribati that used to be skinny and eating fruits and vegetables and fish, and now they're eating chips and Coca-Cola, we have a problem. That population is dying. 50%, they're dying by the age of 50. So there is extinction that's happening faster than we can blink. And so it is not when Robert Kennedy says autism is the biggest pandemic, I said that before COVID. Forget COVID. Autism is our biggest problem. And now we're accelerating autism because we vaccinated all these kids with this spike protein, which kills the microbiome. We've manipulated microbes so that those manipulated microbes kill our microbiome even more, because all for the price of a patent and a price of a stock. So that's what it comes down to. So at some point, we've got to take back the planet. We've got to take back medicine. We've got to let doctors be doctors. We've got to bring back humanity. We've got to stop the division in order to move forward, because literally humanity is going extinct, which maybe that's what it's supposed to happen. Maybe we're just going to be viruses and bacteria in the future. Maybe that, if you think about the dinosaurs were these big, enormous animals full of microbes. Their shit was enormous, right? Probably the size of a building. They probably had so many microbes that body disappeared that housed these microbes, because the microbiome.
It didn't disappear. It's flying around right here in my backyard now. They're birds. That's the modern dinosaur.
So humanity is eventually gonna disappear if we don't stop what we're doing and
That's what autism is, Dr. Sabin.
Planet.
That's what autism is. It's humans disappearing right in front of your eyes. And you know what? Autistic moms don't like when I say this, but it's the truth. This is a cognitive de-evolution caused by control of light. And people don't understand just what you said about the dinosaurs. Light was changed photosynthetically when that asteroid hit Mexico. The same story that gave the radiation to mammals is exactly the same story going on right now, except we created the asteroid in California with big tech. That's the problem. And that's what nobody wants to talk about. But when you point out, then you look at all their shit. The guys that are the stockbrokers, the guys that are the fiat guys, the globalists, they've created this. My belief is they've done it because they need to taper a Ponzi scheme. They want to kill a bunch of people. That's really what the goal is. But the problem is, which I tried to make on the Danny Jones podcast when I was on with Mary and Callie Means. I'm like, you want to legislate through Fruit Loops and red dye number 9. That's not the answer. The answer is we need to stop doing the things that are harming kids. The number one thing is no one should be taking the cocaine, especially a child. Then we need to go to other things. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Because then the doctors can actually do the studies with people like Alexis so that we can actually return equity back to the public so that we're not spending $4.7 trillion and getting the shittiest result you can imagine.
Huh?
It's everywhere. It's not just in autism. It's every disease. I've seen it. I'm older than you. I've been in this game longer than you. I've seen things that, carotid disease that I used to see in 70-year-old men, I'm now seeing in 22-year-olds.
I know. And what did we learn from COVID? Coagulations occur when you have viremia, right? The virus was linked with, pulmonary emboli. That was the biggest lesson that we learned from COVID, right?
Dr. Sabin, do you know the reason why? Do you know the original paper that came out of Wuhan? They gain of function research by Fauci changed one beta chain on hemoglobin. Yeah, think
Oh
about
yeah,
that
yeah,
for.
yeah. I know that. I know that. Yeah, I
So
knew
think
that.
about that. Then we're back to the story again of Becker, the regeneration. If you don't think that those cocksuckers in the DOD and DARPA knew exactly what they were doing, because remember, they're the guys that used to pay Becker to find this research out. What they do, they weaponized it.
Paid, right? I mean, I took care of people at the Department of Defense, and during COVID, and one of the big corporal there said, Dr. Hazen, I think you're the only doctor that knows her shit. And because I literally saved the guy. But, the problem is they're all, des fonctionnaires in French. That's the term. They're all worker bees. They're not gonna ask questions. They're not gonna, otherwise, and if you ask questions, you're gonna get yourself in problems, right? Because Lord help you if you ask questions.
Yeah, you're going to wind up like Mary did.
Well, that you end up like Mary, you end up like Andy Wakefield, you end up, outcasted. But, to me, at the end of the day, I'd rather be outcasted and know something and learn something than be a sheep that just follows, the mantra. Otherwise, what's the purpose of life if not to discover, to innovate, right?
Well,
The
speaking
whole
of people that don't have like curiosity, vision, won't stand up for what they believe, don't like have a spine, like this is all related to the non-native EMFs and blue light in the environment too, that's burning out the nervous system, that is preventing you from critically thinking and asking good questions. So it's like we're in this, like feed forward loop that is keeping us stuck and like
Dog
in
chasing its
cages.
tail. But you got it. That's
Exactly.
exactly what it is. And that's my point about trying to get people to see.
brainwashing. It's a brainwashing that's been happening for years. I mean, look, it starts with these cell phones,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, when they can, I read somewhere today that Facebook is taking young women that are taking selfies and deleting them, and then it uses that to show them ads on makeup. Talk of going to the kid, a teenager, and manipulating their brains to make them feel insecure, to make them feel like they need to look like this. They need to be beautiful. They need to have big boobs, less boobs,
Dr.
bigger.
Hazen, you know who sells all that stuff? You know who's doing that research? Kim Kardashian. I can tell you, I know things that you can't imagine. And guess what? If you knew the real story, I got to be honest with you. That's my war right now with influencers. Influencers are the biggest cancer on this planet. Why? Because they're weaponized by the corporations and by government. They are helping Meta and Facebook. They are helping the technocracy. They're helping the people in the DOD. Every time I see an influencer now, you know what I see? I see Dr. Fauci with makeup. I see Dr. Fauci with sunglasses. I see Dr. Fauci, Ralph Dazak. That's exactly, and I got news for you. When you're marketed the wrong thing, what effectively is happening to Alexis's people, your people, and my people? Time theft. That is the biggest inflation on the planet. And
Theft is definitely, time is something you cannot take back. That's, but
that's
we're here for a purpose, for a bigger purpose. I think when we start looking at this, when we start looking at disappearance of humanity, we're going to start noticing that there's also disappearance of the planet, because unfortunately, disappearance of microbes. Everybody talking about influencers. Everybody's talking about lactobacillus reuteri, right? And, I've yet to see lactobacillus reuteri in any of my patients that I've analyzed their stools, right? So did it disappear? Did we all of a sudden stop implanting it in our guts? And is it really needed with an evolving population? So there's a whole big, story narrative on lactobacillus reuteri, but is that even needed, right? I mean, I look at centenaries. Do they have it? Do they need it? I look at centenaries in Japan. Do they have it? Do they need it? No, but it's a story. Everybody, it's funny because now I'm looking at the data and I read the data, And I'm being asked to validate those papers, but because my papers are retracted, I'm not doing any more validation or peer reviewing. Because why should I validate somebody else's work? It just tells them, yeah, you're right, so that you can push that on. No, I mean, it starts with validating my
Propaganda.
work. It
You're,
starts with
you're
validating.
realizing it's propaganda. I mean, this is something that I think hopefully you come back on with Alexis and do a podcast just with her on this topic alone. I think that you guys could talk for 2 hours just about that topic alone, because to be honest, I think that's one of the reasons why centralized science is really broken, because I don't think the public truly understands the implications of what you just said. I know Alexis does, because guess what? She is the cosmic wand where the data comes from. And then usually it's the lowest postdoc on the poll that's really reviewing the paper, and it's not done properly. So then when the paper comes out, everybody who reads it goes, well, what did we just read? Did we read Marvel Comics, or did we read
That. Yeah,
something
that's what
that's
you read.
good?
That's
It's
what you
kind of
read.
like reading, an influencer Instagram post. Oh, that's
Well,
almost
by the way, the microbiome space right now, that's what it's like. You might as well read Archie comic books. You
right.
get more out of Archie comic books than reading microbiome data. Because when there's a paper that tells me we found the microbe for multiple sclerosis, right? And I read the paper and I look at that paper and I go, well, which population did you use? Did you use a vegan? Did you test was the population vegan, vegetarian, or carnivore? Did you test their blood work? Did you test their what's their BMI? Were they overweight? Were they skinny? Are you testing a skinny person versus a fat person? Are you because that microbiome is different. So how can you say with certainty you found a microbe that causes MS when you didn't even do the basic, which is isolate the population that you're testing to test all the vegan the same way, to test a population in the same community.
You
Because
realize
if
what
you
you just said,
tested
right?
your own,
You
well,
realize what you just said. You proved the point. This is the reason why we need light controls to do this work. This is exactly what you just said, but you used a synonym in the microbiome. And that's why I was sitting here smiling when you're talking, because I really love that. I hope the audience realizes that when you speak and I speak, we're speaking the same language, but we're using synonyms. That's
yes,
exactly what's really happening. And I think Alexis sees this and she's like, as a PhD researcher, she's got to get in the fray. She's got to jump back in the game and say, look, we need to fix this problem. If we're really going to help people, we need both of these ideas to come to fruition so that we can take it and tell the public this is what needs to happen. And you may not need the healthcare system to fix this problem. You may be able to fix this on your own when you improve your light, when you improve your water, you improve magnetism, you ground, you walk at the edge of the beach, you avoid all the influencers on social media, and you do the things that needs to happen. That's really, to me, what the future of decentralized medicine is all about.
Well, that's the
yeah,
beauty too, is that the implementation is very simple and straightforward. For the people who wanna know the why behind it, yeah, there's a ton of science that you can learn and blow your mind, but if people don't wanna know that, they can just, go outside, avoid non-native EMFs, avoid their screens, avoid artificial light, block
That's
blue
what
light
Rick
at
Rubin
night,
does.
get darkness, like, it's
That's
simple.
my patient, Rick Rubin. He's like, Jack, I don't
Yeah,
want to know any
yeah.
of the bullshit with the science. He goes, just tell me what to do. I said, okay, move out of Malibu. And he did. So guess what? He's now got his life back, and the story can be that simple.
who is it?
Rick Rubin,
Oh,
music producer that lives in
oh,
Malibu. He's still got his
to
place there.
see him in Malibu, so he moved out. Good for
Oh
him.
yeah. So the real big issue is I just want people to understand what the state of affairs is. Ask better questions, be curious, understand the perspectives. Like when you say things on social media and I say things on your post, people want to put us, at odds with each other. But really what we're saying is the same thing. You're just talking Microsoft and I'm talking Apple. That's it.
Well, it's been great, and I'm gonna go to my clinic now.
I know you have to leave. I'm sorry we went over, but this was so fun. I wish we could keep going.
But guess what? You have to do a Zoom meet. You have to do a WhatsApp connection by texting so that we can start working on our protocol. Because
Please.
by the way, if you know anything about me, is once I get into, I need to do this research, I'm doing it. So let's buy some Petri dishes. Let's figure out how we want to do the controlled study so we can see the effects of red light in vitro in a lab on the bifidobacteria. I think that would be amazing.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
I'm all in. All in on that. And let's definitely do a podcast separately and we can talk about like all the corruption in the journal industry because I'm so fed up with it.
And you guys you know how to get a hold of me, my cell phone, right?
I don't, but I can contact your assistant.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
And she'll connect.
Well, Alexis has got my cell phone number and she knows my nurse. So
I'll set up a chat.
And she can share my number with you anytime and my email.
This way we can start sharing data and all that. So
great.
No problem.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Here. Bye guys.
Bye.